ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactive Disorder. It is a neurotypical disease that psychologists and anthropologists now recognize has been part of the human condition since as long as humans have existed. However, it wasn't until the 1970s that humans, specifically psychologists, started to recognize ADHD as being something inherent to the human condition. We now recognize that humans have always had ADHD, but it wasn't until the last couple of decades that we've recognized it and taken steps to treat it. ADHD needs to be diagnosed in people between the ages of 6 and 12 and contains several symptoms in order to be classified as having ADHD. In Mexico, it is estimated that about 1 to 2% of everyone in the country has ADHD. However, there are many problems associated with that number. First and foremost is lack of accessible psychological treatment. Many people in Mexico simply cannot afford to visit a doctor or can't afford to take their children to non-necessary medical practices, which leads some people to believe that the numbers are being underreported. Along with that, Mexican analysis of ADHD differs from the American Psychological Association quite significantly, which has led some people to believe that the number is quite actually a bit higher and closer to the percentage in America, which is about 5%. In Mexico, many people still believe that ADHD is somewhat of a character flaw, leading to laziness and inability to pay attention. Many people are not well educated into what ADHD means and all the symptoms that happen because of ADHD. Many people, particularly in schools, still don't have national curriculums and even statewide policies to help people with ADHD. And along with that, lack of resources for special education has led many Mexican students to suffer because of their ADHD, while their non-ADHD counterparts have intrinsic advantages to them that ADHD students do not. It should be noted, however, that despite the fact that Mexico is still a developing country and many resources available in more developed countries are still not as available in Mexico, the Mexican government has made great strides in protecting people with ADHD. Particularly in the last few decades, they have passed sweeping labor reforms and protections which guarantee people with ADHD a right to work and a right to be free from unlawful dismissal and immoral dismissal from their jobs just because they have ADHD. Along with that, in the last few decades, Mexico has also nationalized their healthcare systems, which have allowed the government to introduce policies and procedures in place to diagnose people with ADHD more feasibly, and has led to greater amounts of ADHD being diagnosed in the last few decades as opposed to before that. To finish off, Mexican culture in the last decade has also advanced quite significantly as to how ADHD exists. Many characters with ADHD have begun to be portrayed in Mexican media and literature, which has raised awareness quite significantly. Along with that, many schools are starting to implement policies regarding ADHD appreciation and awareness amongst both people that have it and people that do not, which has quite significantly led to a decrease in social and economic inequalities of people with ADHD. To conclude, Mexico still has a long place to go with regards to ADHD, but they should also be recognized for the progress they have made. China was one of the first national governments in the whole world to recognize ADHD as a mental disorder rather than a character flaw. Along with that, China was also one of the first governments to organize an ADHD association to study ADHD in the country and they were able to pass a single unified definition of what a person with ADHD means and rights given to them. This was due to many of the reforms made in China during the 90s and were far ahead of many countries in the developing world and the developed world to make this decision. The People's Republic of China, however, is still a country that suffers from vast inequalities in the country. Many anthropologists and economists like to refer to China as both a developed country and a developing one. And that's because many parts of China are not the same as many parts of other parts of China. In China, it is said that many people have ADHD but go undiagnosed, similar to Mexico, due to being in rural communities or having a lack of available healthcare to diagnose it. Particularly, China emphasizes national healthcare and preventative health, but does not put as much emphasis into their psychological health systems, especially when it comes to children. This is mainly due to the fact that ADHD needs to be diagnosed between the ages of 6 and 12 in order to be considered ADHD. Additionally, if you were to look up rates of ADHD in China, you would find some very drastically different numbers. What the evidence that I found was either that it was entirely minuscule, near zero or at zero, or just no number was published. And that's because only the Chinese province of Shenzhen has published ADHD reports and analysis to the whole world. It is believed that the central government has also kept these numbers hidden for lack of understanding of what these numbers mean, or a fear that this data could be used against China in some way. They consider it a national secret. And due to the fact that China is the world's largest country and Shenzhen has only 10% of the total population of China, many anthropologists and psychologists are skeptical to use this number to represent all of China, or if they do, they typically put an asterisk saying that it's only for the province of Shenzhen. Along with this, Shenzhen is quite literally the richest province in all of China, which makes the numbers even more skeptical. Some anthropologists have stated that you can apply the number that are coming out of Shenzhen to all of China. However, other anthropologists argue that the economic data that is coming from Shenzhen has contradicted this due to rates of higher diagnosis amongst children whose parents can afford it, which has meant that some people believe that the number in China could quite feasibly be higher, especially given the fact that the more affluent families of Shenzhen are more likely to be able to provide treatment for their children and afford that treatment than the poorer families of rural China. Another interesting fact to note is that many anthropologists have found evidence that Chinese folk religion and folk beliefs have played a part in people with ADHD, particularly an emphasis against people that are to be considered lazy and have an inability to focus. Many people believe that these people are possessed by Chinese demons or some other sort of spirits keeping them from their true potential, and has caused stigma against them in more rural and less developed communities. This, coupled with the fact that Shenzhen being less, as it was mentioned earlier, the People's Republic of China considers their rate of ADHD to be a state secret. In 2004, a dissident psychologist and pathologist was executed in China for trying to publish numbers in his local province of Huaibei to better increase the understanding of ADHD people in that province. Additionally, we have evidence that many Chinese cultural norms still have stigmas against ADHD. There are several profanities that have nicknames that are given to lazy children and little emperors. I won't attempt to pronounce that in Chinese, to say that they are lazy and entitled. This, given the fact that China has a history of a workers' revolution in the communist revolution in the 50s, has led to vast generational shifts between the older generations who still view ADHD as a character flaw and younger generations who are starting to understand that ADHD is intrinsic to the human character and people should not be punished for simple facts as having ADHD. However, many parts of the government are still actively working against people with ADHD, such as requiring them to work in fields that are not conducive to people with that. And along with that, China still has not published any sort of national-wide labor standards that would help people with ADHD better prosper in the country. Additionally, in Shenzhen, from the data we do have, it appears that people with ADHD are also languishing behind economically and socially as compared to people that don't have ADHD. And despite the fact that Shenzhen is the only province that is actively publishing these numbers and has a national council to prevent this, it doesn't seem that the council has taken any action ever, even since it's been created, and hasn't actually done anything. Additionally, the Chinese National Council of ADHD has not published any sort of sweeping regulations for people with this types of condition, given the fact that China was a workers' country as of recently, has led many people to claim that the promises of the communist revolution were not being honored with people that have ADHD. As a final remark, it should also be noted that Chinese traditional medicine and homeopathic cures also recognize something very similar to ADHD as a traditional Chinese affliction that can be cured by stuff like bay leaves and traditional limes in soups and food. However, some anthropologists argue that despite the fact that this might bring awareness for ADHD, it might also bring understanding for what causes it and symptoms that people with ADHD can have. And it also brings attention to the fact that ADHD is not considered curable in the sense that you can be done with ADHD. And by promoting practices such as forcing people to eat such foods and expecting a cure when, quite frankly, that's literally impossible, has led some anthropologists to debate whether the fact if this is a good thing or a bad thing, if recognition is more important than actual understanding. In 2017, the National State Council of China, as well as the Chinese State Politburo, announced sweeping analyses and studies to be done and concluded by the year 2021 that would have announced many of the results of ADHD, or rather they would have introduced them to the party and then they would have decided what to be done with that data. However, no data has come out of that study, and it is estimated that the data is behind on their progress by several years. And many people are starting to doubt if we will ever get ADHD data from the world's biggest country, at least as of now. In conclusion, some parts of China are amongst the most progressive and diverse in the entire world when dealing with ADHD, and have yielded some of the best results when it comes to both treatment, analysis, and diagnosis, which has led many parts of China to understand that ADHD should not be something to be taken against the person themselves. However, other parts of China are still continuing practices that make life, a daily life for people with ADHD, much harder than it should be. And cultural practices in China still play a very huge role in the fact as to why that's happening. Finland is considered to be one of the most progressive countries when dealing with ADHD in the entire world, despite the fact that Finland makes up less than 1.5% of the total EU population. They make up more than 3% of the total population with ADHD in the entire European Union. This is disproportionately higher than you would expect from a small country like Finland. Um, One of the main resources and reasons why the Finnish Republic has been said to have such high amounts of ADHD and such high amounts of diagnosis is due to the fact that every child has the right in Finland to a psychological analysis at least once a year. Parents can refuse this for several reasons, but most people don't see any reason why, as they are seeing it as a free service that the Finnish government is providing. This is very rare amongst the world, as psychological analysis is considered to be one of the most expensive forms of healthcare treatment. And like China, many places in the EU are prioritizing their physical health rather than their mental health. However, Finland is one of the notable exceptions in the EU to guarantee this right to every single child. Because of this, Finland has accrued a very accurate number, at least in their opinion, of people that have ADHD. Along with this, Finland has also published very detailed national definitions of what it means to have ADHD, symptoms that are associated with it, the and the and the causes of ADHD, and several reasons how people can diagnose ADHD. They've also passed very particular model legislation and model curriculum for schools to implement in Finland to educate students on what it means to have ADHD, how ADHD can impact your life, and how particularly to treat other people with ADHD, with an emphasis that despite the fact that they're different, they still deserve respect. Has led to very low amounts of Finnish students being able to drop out of school because of ADHD. And these are several reasons why Finland is considered to be one of the most progressive countries in the whole world regarding this issue. Additionally, the Finnish government recognizes ADHD as a form of disability. And if you're diagnosed with ADHD, the Finnish government will provide you and your family a substantial amount of money, enough to make up for your disability every month to help you succeed in life. Additionally, despite the fact that in Finland every university is free, Finland also offers very generous scholarships that only people with ADHD can apply for to help them succeed in school. Additionally, costs such as housing and food that aren't normally covered for students without ADHD are covered for students with ADHD, which has led to very significant rises in amount of students in universities that openly claim to have ADHD. Some reports state that in Finland, in Finnish universities, it's not unusual to see ADHD alliance clubs, ADHD awareness programs, and people that have ADHD being amongst the top in their classes and university leaders. Additionally, Finland has also implemented curriculums in universities that have aided people with ADHD to better address their issues and address their inability to focus as much as their peers. However, despite the fact that Finland has made such great progress in the last few decades, it should also be noted that Finland has been criticized for lack of parity with these resources when it comes to their ethnic populations, particularly the Suomi people in other parts of Finland. Additionally, with this, many ethnic minorities and especially linguistic minorities still lack as many resources as Finnish-speaking people and Finnish ethnic people have access to in the country. Finland themselves have also announced that this fact is true and that they're working against it. However, the fact that no national initiative has has taken place in the country to prevent this is indicative of the fact that these people aren't considered as important as the actual Finnish people, quote unquote. Many Finns polled have also indicated that they would be against many people in of those minorities, such as a significant Russian-speaking minority, to receive as many resources as they do. And one of the chief resources given is those that was cited by those people is the resources given to people with ADHD. This has caused the fact that despite many people in Finland having ADHD, that other people with ADHD are turned away from the same resources that the country is giving everyone else. Many parties in Finland, both on the right and the left, have called for cuts to spending, especially when it comes to the welfare state in Finland. And one of the chief noted resources is that of psychological analysis, which includes ADHD. Many people say that it is too expensive to test every single child that wants to be tested, and that parents should be obliged to pay for at least some of this. Additionally, the Finnish parliament has passed some small restrictions in the last few decades when it comes to these rights that many people that have ADHD have criticized, yet are still in place in Finland, and has caused many people to recognize that the system as it works now is not entirely perfect. Additionally, many populations in Finland, especially the more rural ones, have also been noted to have ADHD phobia, particularly when it comes to the lack of available work for people with ADHD and the widespread regulations that the Finnish government has imposed upon every single workplace. Many people say that this is unnecessary and actually hinders people that don't have ADHD, and has called for some people to ask for the repeal of every single ADHD law in the country. In conclusion, Finland, while being seen as one of the most perfect countries when it comes to ADHD, is a sign that people with ADHD will have always experienced some sort of prejudice against them, and continue to do it even in one of the most progressive societies in the world. And it is a sign that despite the fact that some people still don't understand what it means to have ADHD, that it doesn't mean that it's fair for people to cut those resources, as communities that have experimented with that fact have also seen very languishing amounts of people with ADHD being employed and going to university and seeking higher educations. One of the most affected fields would be STEM, which have also been noted to pay higher and are well respected in Finnish society. To conclude, as we saw today, many global perspectives from ADHD are drastically different than we have here in the United States. But that is no reason to undermine the amounts of resources that people that have ADHD need and people that have ADHD are available. Rather, we should be focusing on the fact that many people in this country are very lucky with the fact that our country can provide resources such as those and can provide opportunities with people with that. As we saw from countries such as Mexico and China, we need to implement sweeping international labor reforms and reorganizations to understand that people with ADHD cannot work in the same conditions and be expected to provide the same output without special consideration for these people. And as we learned from the intro, this ADHD is a neurotypical disorder, meaning it cannot be cured, only treated. To conclude, ADHD has been proven. To conclude, ADHD has been shown to have very different results of outcome when national governments and people work in tandem to recognize that ADHD isn't simply something that should be treated as a character flaw or should be treated as something that people shouldn't be aware of. As we saw from Finland, they have national rising rates of people that understand what ADHD is and can point out exactly why ADHD isn't a problem, especially in children, when in other countries, many adults still aren't able to do that. In conclusion, we really need to understand what ADHD is better, not in science and not in anthropology, but amongst everyone that lives in this globe.